Everybody, welcome to the final session of today, or at least the final session slot. How many people in this audience are a PHP developer right now? All right, just a handful. I'm curious, how come everybody else came? Who's about to integrate something with PHP then into their SharePoint environment? Just a couple? Is everyone else just kind of curious on what the heck this is all about? Okay, that's good. A little background on this session. I'm not a PHP dev, I'm not a nodeJS dev, but I figured out enough about it in order to put this session together. And I think that puts a really good perspective on the fact that if you don't even know how to do PHP or nodeJS and you spend enough time on it just getting familiar with that language, actually hooking it into SharePoint is not hard to do. So it's something that you'll be able to pick up even with a beginner skill set in those technologies and really push it and integrate it properly with SharePoint. My background is in SharePoint, and I've been working with SharePoint for about 10 years now. My name is Todd Baginski. I'm a 7-time SharePoint MVP, and as I mentioned, I've been working with SharePoint for a decade and PHP for about 3 or 4 months as I put this session together now. My company is called Canvas Consulting, and I'm the vice president there. I head up our mobility and our SharePoint solutions practice. I'm also involved with the SharePoint MCM certification, where I author and teach the BCS portion of that particular SharePoint certification. There's all kinds of ways to get a hold of me, as you can see on the slide here. If you have questions about this or would like code samples or whatnot, feel free to reach out to me. So here's our agenda on what we're going to talk about today. The first thing that we need to do to understand how to integrate PHP into SharePoint is really to kind of roll back a bit and look at the different app models that are available to us in SharePoint 2013 development. Because depending on the app model that you pick, if you want to use PHP, PHP may not be possible in that app model. And so we're going to go through that and talk about what your options are there. The next thing that we're going to touch on is really all these ways to build cloud-hosted apps in SharePoint. And so PHP is a technology that's not going to be running on your SharePoint server. It's going to be running on a server somewhere in a cloud or somewhere else in your environment. And so not only do these concepts I'm teaching today apply to PHP, but they also work with other things like Ruby or whatever you like to write, Perl. Anything that's really not .NET is applicable here too. So I'm going to outline what your other options are that you can follow the same pattern here to implement. Nick Swan, a colleague of mine, is presenting tomorrow around 10 or 10:30 in the morning, and he's doing a session that's very similar to this, which is focused on Ruby on Rails integrated with SharePoint as well. And so Nick and I worked together a lot as we pulled our sessions together, as we figured out the different patterns, especially related to authentication. So if you're somebody who likes or doesn't like or is just doing Ruby implementation, his session would be a good one to check out as well. The other things that we're going to talk about is all the different components you can put into a cloud-hosted application, and whether that's data or services, all the things you can bring to the table to build something in this pattern with an application for SharePoint. Most importantly, we're going to talk about authentication and authorization back from technologies that aren't .NET technologies, and how to authenticate back into a SharePoint server so that you can actually get access to do what you need to do from your application. Once we lay that framework, then we're going to start diving into some more succinct examples on what you need to know about PHP and Node and what's available for you inside of Windows Azure or other hosting technologies like that, how you can build that and integrate it with SharePoint. And then I'm going to start jumping into some specific examples and real scenarios related to ECM, business intelligence, as well as WCM, and show you some demos about how all those technologies can be built like this. Now, this is a topic that is not a huge, broad topic to talk about. Like, I've done a couple sessions so far in the conference where I felt 75 minutes, I couldn't even scratch the surface almost on that particular topic. With this one, it is a topic we can really fully cover front to back in 75 minutes. So I expect you may even get out of here a little bit early tonight, a few minutes, unless there's a lot of questions. So let's start off first and really set the stage on what are the different type of application models we can use to make a SharePoint app, and then see which ones work with PHP. Scott Gu covered this in the keynote. You remember when he broke down the 3 different types of SharePoint application models toward the end of the keynote there? I've summarized them again on the slide here. On the far left, you'll see what you have is called the auto-hosted model. This is the one where you deploy all of your components into a SharePoint site, and a new, what they call an app web, is spun up when you deploy one of these auto-hosted apps to SharePoint, or pardon me, SharePoint-hosted apps to SharePoint. In a SharePoint-hosted app, you can roll out lists and libraries and to do things like hold documents or data. You can deploy workflows, other things like that. The key is that the components you deploy in a SharePoint-hosted application can only have code that calls back into SharePoint and executes from the client machine. So that would mean writing JavaScript to call back into SharePoint and do something. Or if you're just using the out-of-the-box pieces of SharePoint, like a document library or a list or whatnot, then you can just deploy those things into your SharePoint app and use them with the out-of-the-box experience SharePoint provides you. The thing about that approach is this doesn't work with PHP, as you can probably imagine, or Node, because on the SharePoint server, we're not running a PHP server. We're not running Node on there as well. And so if you want to use that type of application, it's not going to fit your needs for PHP. On the other hand, if we move over to the different models we have here for auto-hosted and provider-hosted, here you can now integrate and pull PHP and Node into the picture. The reason is because PHP and Node, as I mentioned before, needs a server that can handle and serve up that type of content. And so because in both an auto-hosted and a provider-hosted model, you're running your code on a server outside of SharePoint, as long as that server supports PHP or Node, you're good to go. In the auto-hosted model, this is the one Scott did a demo on, which is pretty slick. When you deploy it to SharePoint and you trust the application, upon installation of the application on the SharePoint server, it's going to head out to Azure and stand up all the components you want inside of Azure. You can certainly do that with a PHP application by just telling it to install the PHP files on your Azure server, and then the Azure server can run the PHP files when the time comes to do it. I really see that more people may be going to the provider-hosted model with PHP. How many folks who are running PHP right now have their PHP server on Azure? That's what I expected to see. Not a single soul in here is doing it that way. So you have your own web server that's running your PHP pages, and you're going from there. So you're going to be in the provider-hosted model on the right-hand side of the page. And in my demos, I chose to make them in the provider-hosted model because luckily I guessed right that nobody would have Azure with PHP, just because I haven't seen any of my customers do that before either. But you can do it going forward, good thing to note. So in a provider-hosted application, when you deploy the application and trust it to SharePoint, you're merely deploying a wrapper that says, hey, I've got a PHP application, and it's running at this URL. And so what that wrapper does when you activate that application in SharePoint is it just makes an entry into SharePoint to say, here's the app. When you go to all site contents, you can click on the app. When you open the app, it's going to go to an iframe inside of your SharePoint page and show you your PHP page running on your PHP server. In this scenario, we can run client-side code in JavaScript, and we can run code on the PHP server as well. As you'll see in the demos that I have, the pattern that you use to implement this is a hybrid of both. You're going to use PHP code to help you authenticate yourself to the SharePoint server and return the tokens you need to access the SharePoint server. And then after you have them back, now you can jump into client-side code and execute the REST API queries against SharePoint, pass along that access token you retrieved from your PHP code to authenticate yourself and perform the operations you need to do. There's all kinds of different technologies you can use to build cloud-hosted apps, as I mentioned. And this slide really gives you a good breakdown of what they all are. You'll notice I have a nice little blue ribbon here, like the state fair. This wins an award, in my opinion. All of the different things you can do here and that you see related to data and services and different components that you're going to run. Every single one of these technologies listed on this page is completely possible to do in a provider-hosted application. What kind of components can I combine with my PHP application in SharePoint? This slide does a good job of breaking that down as well. As you can see here, we have many different data sources we can call into. We can use databases or service layers or queues or subscriptions or notifications built right into Azure, which I'm actually going to show you in my demo here today. The other thing we can do is use our web pages and build them up the same way we would for any site by using HTML and JavaScript and all those common technologies there. So you get to reuse your skill sets that you have right now. You don't have to learn a lot of new things in order to make this happen. We can take advantage of different jobs, whether you're putting them on your own server or running them in Azure. In my demo, I have a nodeJS worker role, basically, which is going to be running at all times and pulling some data inside of Azure and then reacting to it accordingly. So it's definitely possible to put that type of component into your application as well. And finally, services, you can call into any type of service you want from this scenario as well. So the main point of all this up to where we're at now in the presentation is you're not limited at all in terms of what technologies or components you build inside of your solutions. You can use anything you want, and it's going to work just fine. In my opinion, that's really nice, because how many times in the past have we seen when we've tried to do an integration with a certain product where it's Microsoft or not, if you don't follow their rules and their boundaries, you're kind of handcuffed, right? And you can't do everything you want to do. With this new app model, and PHP is our backdrop today here, it's very easy to see that the sky is the limit on whatever type of technology you want to work with to build an application for SharePoint. This is the most important part of the presentation, in my opinion, is really how the heck do I authenticate from PHP back to SharePoint? Has anybody been in a developer session so far where they broke down OAuth? Just a few people have, not everyone. I thought that would be the case because it's brand new technology, brand new release. Everybody's learning about all kinds of different things at the show, or maybe just waking up too late because they stayed out too late trying to win money the night before in Vegas. But whatever the case may be, I came prepared for that scenario, so I'm going to break it down for you on how the OAuth works in SharePoint. And this is the same as it works for PHP. So the first thing to understand about authenticating a SharePoint application that runs on a PHP server, or any server for that matter, back into SharePoint, so it has the permissions to do what it wants to do, is when you go and you grant your application permissions, you will grant it permissions that you can see in the table here. And the interesting thing about the permission set that you give your application in Visual Studio, you'll see the name for that permission set on the left-hand side of the table. And those permissions would be read, write, manage, and full control. Well, if you're working with SharePoint, read, write, and manage, and full control aren't the exact same names as the permissions we have inside of a SharePoint site. You know, when you make a new group inside of SharePoint or a new user and you grant their permissions and what they can do, those map to the items you see on the right side of that table there. So it's really important to understand what it looks like in Visual Studio versus what permission you're really getting in SharePoint. And that's what that table is all about, to explain that mapping. Now, the next thing to consider is really how does SharePoint register permissions for an application? Well, the first thing is I'll show you in my demo, you go in Visual Studio when you make your SharePoint application, and you tell it which permissions inside of SharePoint that you want your application to have. Then, when a user installs your application on SharePoint, they will see this dialog on the right-hand side of the slide. This dialog is basically listing all of the different permission requests you as a developer specified that your application needs to authenticate to the SharePoint server. When you click Trust It, it's going to work on an all-or-nothing basis. And what I mean by that is that, let's say I'm logged into the SharePoint site and I go to install this particular application. And the only permissions that I have are read access to that SharePoint site. Well, the permission list you can see to the left-hand side of the blue box here is asking for more things than just read access to my SharePoint site. So if I tried to click the Trust It button and I didn't have those permissions, SharePoint would say, nada, sorry, I'm not going to install this app. You don't have permissions to install this app. So it's a nice safety measure there so people can't make an app that does more than they have permission to do and then upload it to SharePoint. On the other hand, let's say I do have all of those different permissions in my SharePoint site, and now I activate this application inside of SharePoint. I go to click Trust It. It sees I have all the permissions, and now what it's going to do is it's going to put an entry into the SharePoint content database that says this application with the ID that I've set under the hood for it, that I'll show you in just a second, this application with this ID has these permissions to this SharePoint site. And so when you come back in as the application into SharePoint and identify yourself as that application to SharePoint, then you are able to execute all these operations and they flow through appropriately. The next thing to point out is what are the other ways to grant an app or remove permissions for a SharePoint application? So I talked about doing, in the previous slide, the first option, which is basically end-user consent by going to your SharePoint site, uploading the application, and then clicking the Trust It button. So that grants permissions. It's the first way to do it. The second way to do it is if you're a tenant or you're a web administrator for your SharePoint sites, then you can go and you can upload it there and activate it as well from a different dialog. And that's another way to go about it. The third thing to point out is when you remove an application from your SharePoint server, that record in the database I talked about that says this application with this ID has these permissions, it is deleted from the SharePoint database. So it is cleaned up and there's no worry about people reusing the ID for that application from a different one perhaps to call back into your SharePoint site with those same permissions. So as you can see, it's very well thought out, it's very secure, and it cleans up after itself and very easy to manage from that point of view. Now, what are the different permissions you may ask for? Well, from a provider-hosted application, as well as any SharePoint application, there is a very big list of permissions you can pick from inside of SharePoint, and in Visual Studio, I mean, to grant to your application to call into SharePoint. I've pulled out the ones that I believe are the most common ones that you would use as you develop SharePoint solutions. There is a whole list of these on the MSDN, which breaks them all down to the nth degree. But these are really the most common one you're going to use. Let me explain how they work for a second. The ones with an asterisk next to them mean that if you grant a permission at this level in SharePoint, those permissions are also going to apply to all the children underneath that particular permission. For example, if I grant SharePoint permission to my application to have read access at the site collection level, I've also granted it to have read access at the web level, at the list item level, everything underneath that site collection. The same goes so on and so forth, like down to the web. If I would do it for a given subweb in SharePoint, then I would be saying that for this subweb and all the lists and content in it, I would have that read access. So depending on what your app is doing, you're going to need to find the correct permission set to grant it inside of SharePoint. And as I mentioned, these are probably the ones you're going to use most often to build a line of business app in SharePoint. Enter the app principal. The app principal is that unique identifier for an application that you deploy to SharePoint, whether that application is running inside of SharePoint as a SharePoint hosted app or as an auto-hosted or a provider-hosted app. The app principal uniquely identifies that app to SharePoint. When you create a provider-hosted or an auto-hosted app, what you can do ahead of time is you can go to the page that you see in the red box at the top of the screenshot. It's called App Reg New. Basically, when you go to that page, you're going to see this screenshot right there. It's not going to be filled in like that, but after you type in the data, it definitely will. When you click the Generate buttons for the client ID and the client secret, it's going to generate one for you on the fly. Those two pieces of information are used to uniquely identify your application to SharePoint. And so you're going to take those two pieces later and you're going to reuse them in your application when you call back to SharePoint and authenticate to it to say, this is who I am. those two pieces of information as well, when you install your SharePoint application, are the pieces of information that get stored inside of the SharePoint content database that hook it to the ACS server that allows you to do the mapping when you come in to look up on a one-to-one basis based on client ID and client secret, which app am I and what am I allowed to do. The whole thing that makes this all possible behind the scenes, that allows us to pass this client ID and this client secret to the SharePoint server and the ACS server to give us access, is all done via OAuth. How many times have you heard OAuth in a developer session this week? Everyone? Every single session? 10 times at least? A lot, right? It's what it's all about. You got to learn OAuth nowadays if you want to build an app for SharePoint, is what it boils down to. And so OAuth is going to take in these two pieces of information, interact with the ACS server and the SharePoint server, and then authenticate you. So let's take a look at this from a visual point of view and really see how many steps are involved and what happens when you make a request to SharePoint to authenticate yourself. So these are the main four players I've got. I've got the guy at the bottom. He's using his web browser to access a SharePoint app. I've got my SharePoint server on the left where I deployed the app. I've got the ACS server, or the Access Control Services server there, which is going to hold on and to the information about what I can and cannot do and authenticate me. I've also got the hosting server, which in our scenario here today, this will be my PHP server, where my application is running on PHP that needs to get back into SharePoint. So let's walk it through real quick. Actually, it's not real quick. It's about a 10-step process. So the first thing that happens is our user in their web browser browses to a SharePoint page. And on that SharePoint page, there is an app that has a cloud-hosted app inside of it. This would be our PHP app. And that's what I'm referring to as the cloud-hosted app. The next thing that happens is under the hood, SharePoint is going to make a request out to the ACS server. And it's going to ask ACS to create and sign a token. And that token is going to contain the context information about this request, the app on the page, the SharePoint server it's running on, and it's going to ask for an auth code back. ACS is going to take that information, and it is then going to return a signed context token. The SharePoint server takes the context token and it renders an iframe on that page. And in the iframe, it's going to use post from the source page into this hidden iframe in order to relay the message to get past a cross-domain call back onto the SharePoint server. The iframe is actually going to be a page running on the SharePoint server itself. Now, the iframe is going to cause the browser to request the page from the cloud-hosted app. And it's going to pass over that context token related to the app we're working with and send that over to the hosting server, in this case, our PHP server. The cloud hosting app then is going to validate the signature on the context token to make sure it is good. And when it does that, it's going to pull out the authorization code. It's going to use that authorization code and the credentials you supply with it to request an access token from ACS. ACS then will return an access token. So at this point, you've basically proven to ACS that you are who you are and this application is who it is, and you're now going to get back the access token that contains what this application is allowed to do. At that point, the cloud-hosted app can now make its calls back into SharePoint because it has the access token required to say, hey, SharePoint, this is who I am. I have this set of permissions. I'd like to execute this operation. SharePoint is then going to look at that access token and either approve or deny the request you're making based on the permissions that you have assigned that app. Those permissions go back to the page we saw before. You know, when I showed you the page where you click the Trust It button and it says these are the permissions the app has, the access token will basically validate you are who you are, and then SharePoint will check those permissions to make sure you can execute your operation. At that point, SharePoint In the scenario that you do have the permissions to perform what you're trying to do, it'll return the information from the query you submitted to SharePoint back to the hosting server. And then at that point, the cloud page is going to render inside of that iframe on your SharePoint page. It's quite a road trip, isn't it? I broke it down one slide at a time. It's not even animated. So if you print them out as notes, you can look at one at a time and lay them all out to really see how that works. I would also recommend looking at the recording of Rob Howard's OAuth session. He uses the same slides that I have here, and he spends 75 minutes deep diving this as far as you can go with it as well. So to come back and get the knowledge you need about this, that would be a great supplemental resource to help you with the authentication part. Now, we know how the access works, and how we grant access, how that works, how all the talking works between all the various servers. Let's start writing some code and see what this looks like. So before we jump into the code, one thing I want to show you is just the specifics related to making a website with PHP and SharePoint. The first thing is you can create your web pages just using regular PHP, HTML, JavaScript. There's nothing special you need to bake into your pages to make them work with SharePoint. The other thing you're going to need to do to enable this access pattern, though, is you're going to have some kind of JSON web token encoder and decoder library, because you're going to have to make your calls from the PHP page back to that ACS server, as I talked about. It was like steps 6 and 7 back in that big, long flow. So in order to call out to the ACS server and work with the access tokens in PHP, there really is no library provided to us by Microsoft to do that. If you've been in a session and seen people do this from Manage Code or JavaScript, you can see that they have created a library in Manage Code to do that for you. It's that class called Token Helper, which has those different, I see people nodding their heads. That has the different methods in it that facilitate the interaction with ACS and do the OAuth for you. Well, with PHP, you have to roll your own to do that. But the good news is this is going to become a code sample on MSDN before the end of the year. So you'll be able to just grab this code sample and run with it instead of trying to figure it all out from scratch. The library that I used was one called JWT. And it is in a library, I forget the exact place on GitHub, but it's in the notes for this deck. And there's all kinds of different libraries out there that do this for Ruby, for PHP, for all kinds of different technologies to allow you to encode and decode JSON and web tokens. After you've done your interaction with the ACS server and used such a library to get back your access tokens and whatnot, then you're going to need to submit requests to the SharePoint server, and you have to do that via the REST APIs. Has everybody already seen the underscore API mentioned this week? Anybody not seen that yet? That's good. We got good coverage there. So that's how you're going to get back into SharePoint from your PHP page. You're going to use JavaScript, or you could use the curl functionality that comes with PHP to actually put together the web requests you need to send to SharePoint to execute those REST APIs. Things specific to Node. I was absolutely blown away when I started working on this and doing my research on how much you can do with Azure capabilities straight from Node and code samples that Microsoft gives you. At the bottom of the page, you'll see a URL here to the Azure Developer Center, the Developer Center specific to Node. Based on what I found, anything you can do in Azure with Managed Code, you can do with Node. You can write to a topic or a subscription or a queue. You can make a worker role. You can stand up a RESTful service endpoint. Whatever you'd like to do. You can interact with the service bus. They've got APIs specific to Node to make this all possible for you. Now let's dive into some more real-world examples now that we've got the theory behind us and really see how this can help us extend SharePoint and build apps on PHP that integrate and enhance with SharePoint. I'm going to start out with collaboration and ECM. Who's got PHP apps out there that do this kind of functionality in your organization? Just see one, okay. Maybe you'll start doing them after you see this part of the session. What you can do to integrate with PHP or Node from a collaboration perspective would be, maybe you've got an application running in PHP and it supports a certain line of business scenario for you. And you'd like to introduce document management as part of the process that your PHP application works with. Where's a great document management system? SharePoint, right? That works great for document management. So what we could do is we could store documents in SharePoint. We could integrate them into our PHP line of business application or our nodeJS application. And we could do that straight from these patterns I'm about to show you. The other things that we could do is, for example, we could store taxonomy information in SharePoint. Make ourselves a bunch of keywords and metadata and things like that that we would like to tag our information with. We can use the RESTful APIs in SharePoint to come back into SharePoint and work with the term store and the taxonomy and use that to classify items that may not even exist in SharePoint, but we could maintain our term store in SharePoint there as well. So that's a couple ideas that I had right off the bat when I thought about ECM and collaboration related to working with PHP. Here's my example that I have right here to show you here in just a second on my demo. In my demo, what I'm going to do is create a provider-hosted application. This provider-hosted application is going to deploy a document library out of the box into SharePoint and a content type associated with that document library to classify my documents with some different columns and metadata and things like that. Then I'm going to have a different server, my PHP server, in my case, PHP running on Windows Azure, and the PHP page is going to actually use the RESTful APIs in SharePoint to come back in to SharePoint and interact with those documents. It's going to allow me to check them in, check them out, list the documents in the document library, upload a new file. There's many more things you can do with the REST APIs. In fact, anything you can really do inside of a document library with SharePoint, those RESTful APIs will allow you to do the same thing. But for my demo, I kept it simple with these main pieces of the puzzle. So then you can have your users, you can see they're all really excited about working with your PHP application now because it's right inside of the PHP app that they do their work on all the time. They don't have to learn how to get into SharePoint and authenticate to SharePoint and log in and manage their documents in a separate place. It turns out that not everybody is as excited as it may appear on the surface there. And everybody in here looks like that right now, too. Long day, huh? So this is the high level of the architecture behind my demo right now. And so now what I'm going to do is jump in and actually show you this demo in action and explain all the components to you. There we go. Okay. So the first place that I'm going to head is I'm going to go out to my SharePoint server here. There we go. So this SharePoint server is actually running on Office 365. This is live on the RTM bits here. And what I have done, if I go to the site settings or site content section here, you'll see that I have deployed this app that I have my cursor over right now. This is just called PHP with OAuth. I'll show you the code for this in just a second, but I've already deployed the application, I've installed it, I've trusted it, and here it is ready to go in my SharePoint site. So when I click on the PHP with OAuth app, the first thing it's going to do is redirect me. And you will notice here, pardon me, we started on the SharePoint server, but now you can see in the top, now I'm actually running this web page off of my Azure website. And it is indeed a PHP web page, as you can see in the URL there. So it looks like SharePoint, though. And so I have some Chrome applied to it that pulls in the Chrome from the SharePoint site that hosted this. So to my user, it still appears that they're within the context of the SharePoint site, even though I'm running on a completely different server. And I'll show you how to add that Chrome as well. The title here of my application I use to help illustrate where are these documents coming from. These documents are coming from a document library called Shared Doc that I created as I rolled out my provider-hosted application to SharePoint. I'll show you in Visual Studio where I did that in just a second. But essentially, when I deployed this application to SharePoint, the first thing it did was it trusted SharePoint and it trusted the application and gave this app the permissions it needed to do that I asked for. The next thing that it did is within the app web associated with the SharePoint app, it instantiated an instance of a document library and it named it Shared Docs. So inside of the context of my app on my SharePoint server, I have this document library where I can now interact with these documents. So let's go back over to my site here. And you will notice in the URL here, you see how we have the same name of the server I was running on before, and then it has all those little characters and numbers in it? That signifies the identifier for the app web associated with this SharePoint application that I deployed to my SharePoint server. You'll also notice in the path there that after it gets to the point where I was at /site/dev3, which is the host site I deployed this application to, then you can see the URL that indicates the document library I deployed as part of this SharePoint application. So here's my document library. I have a few different documents in it. I've got an Excel sheet, I've got a PowerPoint presentation, a text file, and I just was testing earlier today and uploaded a configuration file I had on my machine related to an Azure deployment. So here's the documents inside of SharePoint. Here's the documents inside of SharePoint, except now I'm looking at them from a PHP page instead of a SharePoint page. So I can do a few different things here to the document. If you see this little icon right there, the green one, that icon indicates that this item is currently checked out by somebody inside of SharePoint. So you can figure out things like that and do that in your UI and build it out as robust as you'd like. So for example, if I'd like to check in the Happy Face document, then I can come here and just merely select Check In. Check in was successful. Page refreshes. It shows it's not checked in anymore. Returning to SharePoint, I'll refresh the page and you'll see the little green icon there goes away. That's been checked in. So you can do things like that very quickly, and you'll notice I'm using Ajax and jQuery in my PHP page, so I don't have to refresh the page at all. It's a very seamless experience for my end users. Some of the other things that I can do is if I come in here, for example, and just go the other way with this, and I'd like to come to these files, and I'm going to check out two at a time. I checked them out inside of SharePoint. Now we'll jump back to the PHP server and reload the page, and you'll see that now they have been checked out here as well. So things go very quick. These APIs work real nice. Pretty seamless experience. We can also do things like uploading files. I can come in and add a new document, go find a document that's interesting to me. Let's just run with the desktop any file since it's right there and submit that document. And now that document's going to be there inside of SharePoint as well. So there it is, and then back over here, and you've got it there too. So as you can see, this is a pretty powerful story to tell because you can definitely take a line of business app, thank you, and integrate it from PHP right into SharePoint. Very seamless experience. And as you've seen, if you want to make it look like it's still running in SharePoint and have your user's avenue be SharePoint to get into it, you can wrap that Chrome around it. You don't have to, though. You could make your application so that you deployed it, you stood up that list in SharePoint, you have your page on your PHP server, and then you just go right at your PHP page instead of flowing through SharePoint to do it. So there's all kinds of flexibility that you have with that piece of the puzzle as well. So let's take a look at the different things that support this example. First, I'm going to start off in Windows Azure. This is site right here in my Azure tenancy, PHP with OAuth. This is the site where my PHP page is actually running. Has anybody ever worked with Web Matrix before in Windows Azure? I see a couple heads nodding. Who has never seen Web Matrix before? This is a really neat piece of functionality. If you go and stand up a new website in Azure, it takes like 3 clicks to do it. You just tell it the name of your URL and the name of your site pretty much. After you do it, you land on a page that looks like this. When you get to that page, you can come to the bottom here and click the Web Matrix button. Web Matrix is a lightweight IDE that Microsoft provides us that allows us to edit web pages and websites that run on Windows Azure. So right now, after I clicked it, what it's doing is it's going out to Windows Azure, it's loading up Web Matrix, it's downloading the current version of everything from that Windows Azure site. It's going to install any components I also need locally on my machine in case I want to test it locally in IIS Express. And that includes PHP and Node and everything. It'll detect whatever you've got going on your site. It'll pull it down and put it on your client machine. So you can do all your development right on your laptop, and then when you're done, you just publish it back to Azure very easy. So you can see it's asking to install some dependencies for PHP here on this machine. I made sure I uninstalled them before I did this demo so you could see that part of the puzzle. Bang, I'm done. This machine is now ready to run this guy locally. If I go down to files here, here is the index.php file that we were just looking at before. Let me make that a little bit easier to see. Is that good in the back row? Legible? All right. So now we're going to start walking through the different pieces of code that actually make all this happen. And we're going to walk through that 8-step process, or at least a lot of them as they're represented in code here today. I've added some additional comments to this on this one right here to make it a little easier to explain as well. So let me jump over to my other web matrix. There we go. So here is the exact same page we're looking at, just running off a different machine where I added some more comments to help explain it a little easier to you today. So the first thing you'll notice is that the very first line, there's my delimiter, and I'm running PHP on here. So the thing that I'm going to do inside of PHP is what I'm going to do is I'm first going to grab the app web URL out of the query string. The app web URL is what I'm going to need to get back into SharePoint to do part of my authentication to help determine where I came from. Next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to check to see if I have an app token as part of the request. If I don't have that app token set, then I'm going to create a new cookie, and I'm going to use this cookie to store the security token that I get back from SharePoint and the ACS server. But I'm just going to put it in a cookie on my machine, and then subsequent requests, because I'm cookied with that access token, are going to work for me. You don't have to store it in a cookie. And if you think that's an insecure approach, that you're going to cookie somebody and leave that access token on there because that token has permission to get into your SharePoint app, you may want to look at a different avenue of how you're going to get that token back, maybe on each and every request, or how you would cache it somehow and retrieve it and made sure it expired at the end of a session. That's just really an implementation detail, not specific to SharePoint there, though. In the event that I don't have my access token set yet, here's the way I'm going to go get it. The first thing I'm going to do is I am going to go grab the app token out of that request. And this is when I talked about before, how the SharePoint server is going to go to ACS and get that app token back so it has the context of what's going on, which application you're authenticating from, which SharePoint server you're coming from, etc. When I get the app token back, here's that JWT library I talked about. I'm going to now decode the access token so that I can work with it and extract information from it in order to interact with ACS and authenticate myself. Here I'm extracting the info I need to figure out which ACS server I'm working with. Depending on your SharePoint tenancy, you could be assigned to one or another ACS server in the Microsoft Cloud there. So you have to figure out which ACS server is going to authenticate your app. And to do so, that's why you extract this information. After you extract the information, then you can decode it, and you can actually figure out the exact URL that you're going to need to call for the ACS server in order to request your access token back. After you've done that, then pretty much you're going to use the curl, and all the information above it here, as you can see, where I'm setting the headers and the body and everything that goes into this request out to the ACS server, as well as the things down here at the bottom. And all that code there essentially does, collectively, is figure out which ACS server is associated with this application, assemble the request to go get my access token from the ACS server. After you've done that, and you get your token back, then here I'm going to set the cookie and I'm going to add that access token. So you could make the lifespan of that cookie real small, as I said, or you could set other options on it if you wanted to expire real quick, so on and so forth, whatever makes the most sense for your implementation from a security point of view. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and get the contextual information associated with this app in this particular request at this point in time. Again, I'm calling back into SharePoint now, as you can see here with the underscore API. Because I've added that cookie to my machine, I have the access token inside of the web browser, and so subsequent requests to the SharePoint server will work because that's going to be in part of my cookie, and it will authenticate me. Here, I'm calling back into SharePoint to find the contextual information associated with this app and this request at this point in time. When I do that, I'm going to get the result back, and I'm going to extract what's called the form digest value. The form digest is a control that goes back many, many years in SharePoint, and it's essentially used to make sure that your session hasn't timed out, you are who you are, and the request you're submitting back to SharePoint, SharePoint can validate it came from the SharePoint server, and you're not hijacking SharePoint to perform a malicious activity. When I get the form value back, that is essentially going to be set right down here inside of my HTML. I think I went a little too far. There it is. So here's where you set the form digest. Anybody familiar with form digest? And people have been doing development with SharePoint a long time. That's how you take care of that piece of the puzzle to make sure you can authenticate to SharePoint okay. Once you get the form digest back, then now what you can do is you can invoke a query into SharePoint with this code right here. The important thing to note here is really underscore API web get folder by server relative URL. Here's the path to my document library. When you put /files on the end of it, this is basically a request that's going to say, get me all of the documents in the document library. Anybody use the curl a lot? Do things like this? It looks really familiar to you guys, I imagine. For those of you who haven't seen it before, is it sinking in? I'm from a conceptual point of view, even though the code syntactically looks different than what you're used to. It's good to see all the nods out there. So I have factored this code out to the nth degree. I'm using knockout.js to allow me to use an MVVM pattern and data binding to my pages. I'm using jQuery, which has been factored out to the nth degree as well, to assign event handlers and various things like that too. It would take a very long time to talk through all of those concepts, and they're not really specific to PHP and SharePoint. They're really more general web dev topics. So if those are kind of patterns that you use on how to make your code very component-oriented and easy to adjust and change your UI versus the business layer on the back end, this will be a great example when it pops up on MSDN shortly for you to use to learn those techniques as well. That was how you could actually go about getting the data from PHP and pulling that information back into SharePoint. One thing that you may have noticed is when I actually ran the query here, so much code. When I ran the query here to get the results back of all the documents from the document library, I never did anything with it. I just used this here in debugging to demonstrate to myself that this pattern was valid. And then I could actually go and data bind that to something on my SharePoint page. Well, there's another pattern you can use as well, which I think is easier than actually using PHP on the server side to execute your requests. So although this did pull the information back, I really never did anything with it besides look at it in the debugger and validate it worked. When my page loads, the document.ready function here is going to fire. And the document.ready function is going to do a couple different things for me. The first thing that it's going to do is it's going to go out and execute that exact same request now to get all the files back and bind them with the knockout.js and display them on my PHP page. The other thing that it's going to do is it's going to add that Chrome at the top and the left side of my SharePoint page so it looks like it's running inside of SharePoint. I think as you'll see, the JavaScript pattern to get with jQuery after you've already cookied yourself and got the access token is a much easier way to write the code. Unless you're these guys over here who know how to use the curl all the time. For those of us who don't, this is a really good pattern to use when you know JavaScript to then call back into SharePoint. It's going to be a lot of the same code patterns that you've seen all week long on how people are using JavaScript to query a SharePoint server. So let's first start out with how I chromed this particular web part. Or I keep saying web part, you know, old school, it goes way back. But how I did this SharePoint app and how I put the Chrome around it. The key pieces of the puzzle that you need to know are the host web URL. The host web URL is the URL to the SharePoint server where you installed the SharePoint app. So I'm going to be able to get that out of the query string by just calling this JavaScript function here, which will look for this value and return it. Once I have the host web URL, then I'm going to tack on the underscore layouts /15 /directory. Then inside of this method, or this function right here, getScript is going to take that string that I just appended of my host SharePoint server and layouts 15 after it, and then it's going to ask for that file you can see there called SPUI controls.js. SPUI controls.js file is what facilitates the ability for you to call back into the SharePoint server and request the Chrome from the SharePoint server so you can slap it on your page. And so the way that this getScript works is that once it loads the script at this path, and that's available inside of the web browser, then it's going to execute this function right here. So if we go down to render Chrome, let me just search for it. There we go. There's a couple things you can do in Render Chrome. The first thing is you can set this options array. You can make your own menu items inside of it to add to the top bar in SharePoint that may be specific to your application. You can register event handlers for things such as clicks and whatnot on those so people can action those menu items. So maybe they're navigating from one page or another in your PHP app at this point. And you're putting the menu right on top. This allows you to build that menu out very easily and put it right in the Chrome at the top of the page. The other thing which I'm doing here is setting the title for the app. You saw that same text right there. That's what appeared above the list of the documents in my PHP page. And it was branded to look just with the same color scheme applied to my SharePoint site. After you set the options, then you'll call the line of code below it. Here I'm going to create a new variable and use that SPUI controls navigation JavaScript file. I'm going to pass it two arguments. The first argument I'm going to pass it is the ID of a HTML element on my page where I want it to inject the Chrome. And so this one is called SharePoint Chrome Control. Here it is right there as well. You'll notice I have it at the very top of the body in my HTML. It's just a div. It's got nothing in it. It's got the same ID. So when when I make this call on line 491 here, and I tell it, make me a new navigation control, Here's the options that you need to apply to it. And then I tell it to land it in this div. When I call this line of code, it's going to go to the SharePoint server, take my options into account, grab the HTML and CSS associated with the brand currently applied to that SharePoint site, return the HTML and all the CSS necessary to support it, and drop it in that div at the top of my page. That's all you have to do, and you've chromed your SharePoint site. Once you do it once, you're copy and pasting this over and over in all your pages, and it just goes really, really quick for you. The next thing that I would like to point out is how we're interacting with the SharePoint data from the PHP page, but instead of calling it from PHP with the curl like I showed before, now I'm going to use the APIs in JavaScript to get there instead. It's a little bit easier of a pattern if you're not used to coding in PHP for sure. To do that, what I'm going to do is use this particular function here. I named it execute cross-domain request. I'm making sure that before I call this function, I've also loaded that SP request executor JS. You remember in my slides when I talked about that iframe that gets on the page and how when you call code from your PHP page, it's going to call into that iframe which really sits on the SharePoint server and it's hidden? It's going to post messages into the iframe that runs on the SharePoint server, which in turn is going to call into SharePoint to do your work. That's how you're getting around a cross-domain call issue. Because really, you're instantiating the call from the PHP page, but the call is being posted into a hidden iframe, which really runs on the SharePoint server, which then is on the same domain as SharePoint, so there's no cross-domain issue that you have to worry about. SharePoint takes care of wiring up that iframe and doing all that for you and passing and posting the messages in and out of it. All you have to do is make sure that you've loaded this file right here and then call into a function to take advantage of it. Execute cross-domain request. Let's go find this guy now. Looks like this. The first thing you're going to do is I'm going to initialize this request executor, and I'm going to create a new one. Notice my app web URL, which you saw me scrape and document ready from the query string. The app web URL is needed because this app has permissions to do something in that app web URL, right, when I registered it. So now I'm registering it to say, this is the URL associated with the app that has permissions to come back into SharePoint. After I do that, I'm going to create a new function called getAllFiles, and then I'm going to have it call into the success event here. And here you can see just good old JavaScript here is part of this request executor execute async method. This is part of that file that I told SharePoint to give me that uses that iframe under the hood to get me past the cross-domain call. When I tell it to execute async, I tell it which URL I want it to make a request to. I tell it what type, whether it's a put or post or a get or whatnot. I specify that there as well. I set the headers. This is the one you need to set to work with the REST APIs into SharePoint. And then I tell it what to do when the function is successful. And so here basically what I'm going to do is get the information back from SharePoint, and then I'm going to use knockout.js and bind it to the rest of my page and show it there. So on and so forth with the other examples. You've got how to check in a file. It's just another REST query that you're going to execute. You can see it looks a little bit different here. Checking out is pretty simple as well. So on and so forth. It's all syntactical at that point, and you can find out what all these operations look like in the MSDN for whatever you want to do with the SharePoint API. The pattern just repeats over and over depending on what you click inside of the page at that point. That's pretty much going to sum up that simple demo, which shows, the ECM document management and how we authenticate back into SharePoint. So let's jump back to the slide deck and look at a scenario where we pull Node into the mix. So here, we're going to talk a little bit about business intelligence and what you can do here with BI and these technologies. The first thing you can do is you can gather information from SharePoint sites, as I showed you, very easily by running that code to pull it out of there. You could have a business intelligence scenario where people are entering data in the lists in SharePoint. And perhaps you love the fact that it's easy for them to work with the SharePoint list and you can govern their access to those lists really easy and spin them up and edit their structure and all that very simply from the web browser. Now you've got users punching information in there. Maybe you'd like to be able to aggregate from all that data on all your different site collections and places like that and pull it into some type of data warehouse and then program into that data warehouse from PHP to do your visualizations for your charts and graphs and things like that. Here's the example that I have that we're going to go through a demo on here which illustrates such a scenario. In my scenario, imagine that you have this structure that kind of lays out the site, sub-site hierarchy in your SharePoint environment. You've got the home site, you've got a site for the finance department, you've got other departments inside of it that are operational, and they are geographically created for your north, south, and your east and your west division in your company. And you would love to be able to take that data. As you can see, the charts correspond to the colors of the data related to the north, south, the east, and the west here. What you can do is you can deploy an auto-hosted or a provider-hosted app into each one of those particular site collections or sub-sites. That auto-hosted app can deploy an inventory list. So we saw, or provider-hosted, whatever kind of app you want here. You saw how I made a document library that I got deployed into my SharePoint site there and how that was part of my application. It spun up that document library for me. Well, you can, in this case, maybe spin up a list to track inventory across the different divisions in your company. Then you could also deploy your components to Windows Azure and a Windows Azure SQL database to allow you to store and data warehouse the information that the users were editing inside of their SharePoint sites. My example looks like this. It's the exact same components we saw before. In the yellow box, I'm signifying I have a SharePoint server. It's running on domain A. And then it's deployed to sites 1 through N. As many as you want. You could keep deploying this application to. And it's going to deploy 3 things. The first thing it's going to spin up is a remote event receiver. Has anybody seen a remote event receiver yet? Just a couple people. A lot of people don't know what it is, I'm imagining then, since you haven't seen it. It's brand new to 2013, SharePoint. A remote event receiver allows you to say, when something happens in a SharePoint list, like item added, item deleted, checked in, checked out, all those kind of things, instead of executing code on the SharePoint server, I want you to go and execute code on some other remote server. And so that's what I've got here in my example. The remote event receiver is going to listen to changes that happen on the inventory parts list that my application deploys. And then I'm also going to have an iframe where I can display the charts and graphs of that information, and that iframe is going to be pulling that page that runs on domain B, on my PHP page. And so the way it's going to work is someone makes a change to the parts inventory list, and the remote event receiver calls out to the Windows Azure website. And the Windows Azure website in my demo has got a nodeJS endpoint on it. That node endpoint is then going to submit the changes of the data, whether I added a new item to the list or I updated the information. It's going to go drop it inside of an Azure topic subscription. You could put the data in a queue in Azure as well, but queues in Azure are only guaranteed to live for 12 hours. So if you're trying to assemble a data warehouse, you probably want to make sure that you can process everything in your queue and it's not going to go away. It stays there forever. So I'm going to queue that information in Azure Topic Subscription, and I'm going to put it in the queue from nodeJS as well. After I've got it in the Topic Subscription, I have an Azure worker role written completely in nodeJS as well. And that worker role's job is going to be to ping that topic and subscription and look for things that are inside of it and determine if the item that was in it is an update to an item already in my SQL database in Azure or if it's a brand new item. If it finds an item in there, it's going to pull it back and it's going to work with it to commit the update or the addition to my SQL Azure database. And so now, as users are working with data in SharePoint, I haven't written any .NET code except a little bit of code on the SharePoint server to implement the remote event receiver to in turn call out to Azure. And at that point, this whole demo is Node the entire way. Then, when someone comes and they look at the information from that auto-hosted BI app and they want to see the roll-up data there, what's going to happen is they're going to go hit the Windows Azure website, which is in turn going to use PHP and Node to query the SQL Azure database and return the information so it's rendered on the screen. It's quite a pattern, isn't it? Did anybody even think that that was like possible to do? In fact, I brainstormed this thing in my head and said, wouldn't that be a cool demo? And then I went to the Azure Developer Center and started poking around all the things you could do with PHP. And I found out every single one of these things already had a code sample on it. That's when I was saying I'm amazed at what you can do with Node. And for a guy like me who doesn't come from a Node and a PHP background, but I'm a guru with SharePoint, it was everything I needed to pull this together really quickly. So definitely a lot of support and code samples to help us out there. So that's what we're looking at from a conceptual point of view. Anybody like to see it work? I know I would too, so I've recorded it just in case it doesn't, but I've got good faith in this guy. So let's jump back out here to my SharePoint server and go take a look at this demo here. Okay, so the place I'm going to start out with is I've created, just like I had in my slide deck, I've created 4 site collections in Office 365. And you can't see them right now because I forgot to push the button. There we go. Thanks, Mike. The first one you see here, this is my Contoso Compressors North Division. If we take a closer look up here at the URL, you can see that that is a SharePoint Tennessee /sites/north. I've also created one for south. I've created one for east. I've created one for west. They're all identical. I have deployed my provider-hosted application to all 4, the identical application deployed to all 4 of these site collections. So let's go back to the north one, for example, here, and go take a look at the site contents. And inside of the site contents, you'll see here I have my remote event receiver demo. And so this is the application that I created in Visual Studio to wrap it for SharePoint to say, hey, you're going to call out to somewhere else. I'd like to jump over to Visual Studio now and actually show you what this looks like. This is the package that I'm assembling right here in Visual Studio. This is all the code that goes out and gets deployed as part of this application to SharePoint. You'll notice I have something called CT inventory. That's my content type that has the fields that you'll see that drive the list and support my ability to track inventory from a SharePoint list. The next thing that I have is my inventory NDB piece right here. If we take a closer look at that one, you'll see this is called a client web part. A client web part is basically, it's kind of like the page or the old good old iframing web part that we would use in SharePoint, you know, to just go look. What was that thing called? The page viewer web part, I think. That web part, it's kind of the same thing. It's basically a way to say, I'm going to drop this web part on a SharePoint page, but really, this SRC attribute right here in line 8 is where I'm going to run it. So my PHP page that's going to roll up the data from north, south, east, and west, that's where it's going to run, even though it looks like it's inside of SharePoint. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my inventory list instance. And here, well, that looks familiar, doesn't it? If you've done SharePoint Dev before, this is just the good old declarative markup to create an instance of a list in SharePoint. So when I deploy this to SharePoint, it's automatically going to make this content type for me and hook it up to this inventory list and make me an instance of the inventory list as well. Here's the remote event receiver hook. Basically, this XML here registers my remote event receiver with my inventory list. And you can see that it has this URL parameter here called remote app URL. When this is deployed and packaged by Visual Studio, Studio is going to take this placeholder and it's going to replace it to be the one that I set in my properties that specified my endpoint in Azure that I want to call when something changes in this list in SharePoint. So let's jump back over to the demo now that we see how we got that deployed there. So when I installed this guy, all those things got stood up, and I've already went over to my quick launch, and I just added a link so I could get to it quickly here from the demo today to the inventory list. Again, you'll see at the top of the page here, there's a new set of characters after my tenancy name that scope this request to the app web associated with this particular SharePoint app I've just deployed, the one called Remote Event Receiver Demo. If we take a look at might as well leave that zoomed in. We take a look at the list data in here. I've got 2 items here that I've created data for in my samples in the north side. I've got a lug nut and I've got an 11 millimeter machine screw. So we're just talking about inventory, Contoso compressors. I figure Contoso needs these things to build a compressor. And so they're going to track their inventory in their north, south, east, and west manufacturing facilities. As they go do the inventory, they track it in their SharePoint list, and we're going to roll it up to the data warehouse and do that with the node piece. I'm going to jump over real quick here and show you some of the other sample data that I have. Here in my south site, if I jump over to the inventory list there, you'll notice I've just got the exact same part here, the lug nut, 15 millimeter. It's got different inventory levels set. Also notice I've got the reorder threshold. I just noticed I misspelled that record threshold, but that should be reorder threshold. And then I have my current inventory. So as you will see, when I roll this up in my PHP page, it's going to do a calculation on that and give me a facility to do a reorder if I'm below my safety threshold for my inventory amounts there. The east and the west site just have the same lug nut 15 millimeter in there with different inventory values as well. Hopping over to my PHP page, I chose not to go about chroming this one to just demonstrate, hey, this is running straight off SharePoint or straight off my PHP server. I'm browsing straight to it from this URL you can see right here, remote event handler db.azurewebsites.net. That particular guy, if we pop over to here, that's this over in Windows Azure. So this is the website running in Windows Azure that hosts that PHP page. If I wanted to edit it, I could click the Web Matrix button just like I did before. It's going to download everything from the site. I can edit it in Web Matrix. I've already done that, and here it is right here on this page. So there's my PHP file. And all the code in there, which is going to go query the information from the SQL Azure database. All right. The nice part about this editing environment is if I make a change here, all I have to do is hit publish, and it's going to save it to my Azure site. I don't have to assemble a package and then upload that to Azure and wait a long time. I just save it, 3-4 seconds, bang, your change is committed. So it's a really rapid way to do your deployments to Azure as well. Okay, so let's jump back over here. And here you can see, I've got the item from the north, I've got the item from the south. Here's that other item I had in the north. The reorder threshold is set accordingly. I can filter it and look at the ones just specific to an individual region. I'm not in SharePoint, but all this data definitely started out in SharePoint, and now I've got a nice data warehouse of it. For an example like this, I mean, simple data and things like this, I'm sure you're thinking data warehouse, are you kidding me, right? But you get the picture, right? You could definitely put some real analysis services and cubes and other things like that behind it and really crank at that data and do some very detailed analysis. So let's see how fast and performant this guy is. It's pretty impressive how fast this node stuff runs. So here we are, where are we at? We're in the South Division, and I'm going to go edit this list item because I just walked through the warehouse. and took my inventory, and I counted them all up, and I found out that we only have 7 15-millimeter lug nuts left. So I'm going to save that information right there. At this point, that's not good. At this point, instead of wasting any time, I'm going to hop right over to where I recorded it. I'll give it one more shot, but I've got it recorded from earlier this afternoon just in case. Let's go over and try it from the north site here real quick. Jump into the inventory page. All right, let's go after the 11-millimeter screw there. So now we have, let's say, just 11 instead of 290. So I'm going to save that guy. There we go. That one worked okay. All right, so I've got 11 here, as we can see it in SharePoint, right? Let's go back and see what we have in the SQL Azure database there. So now when the database comes back, it's still 90. Sometimes it takes a second because my worker role is set on a little timer, not to run but every 10, 15 seconds. So I'm imagining, as I've had some problems with network connectivity here at the conference, I got a backup plan, so we're just going to watch the video of this one flowing here instead. All right, there we go. So I'm going to start out here, and it's going to walk through some of the things you saw before. First of all, I've got the inventory, and I'll go into site contents and demonstrate the application I showed you that was applied before and how I installed that. And I'm just going to fast forward right to the spot where we tried it. So here, I'm just walking through the different sites and showing the inventory. Let me find the spot where we actually do the edit on it. All right. So we've got 100 in there right now as our reorder threshold, and we currently have 200 in our inventory. So now what we're going to do is we're going to hop back to the SharePoint site. We're going to go into that inventory list, do just what I tried to do before. We haven't seen the change occurring yet. Edit the item. And I'm going to take that inventory below the reorder threshold now. And I'm going to hit save. And now I'm going to bounce back over to my PHP page, and you'll see here we're at 200 for our inventory right now. Refresh the page a couple times. Bang, there it is at 90. So I didn't do any pausing in between that whole demo, as you just saw that. I got right from the page in SharePoint right over to PHP, and then everything immediately updated. And it even changed my little icon there we saw at the end to say, hey, click here to reorder. And so I've seen this happening with the network connectivity a couple times. I've tested it earlier today too. So I think that's what's going on here. But we've got just a minute or two left here. Let me show you and give you a tour on what the code looks like. This is the node code that I wrote to receive those notifications from my remote event receiver. My remote event receiver is calling into this nodeJS endpoint in the server that I've instantiated. You can see that I have a few different functions in here that'll add the items to the queue in Azure, read them from it. Look how simple they are. It's amazing. This SDK that we have with JS and Node here inside of Azure is so easy to use. That's all it is. If you look through it, we've got how many lines of code? 88 lines of code to support the full deal inside of putting data in a queue, reading it from a queue, committing it to a database, reading it back out of a database from PHP. Very, very easy and simple stuff to write there. Finally, I want to talk about what you can do with web content management. And there's not a demo built around this one, so this is a pretty quick wrap-up for us. But essentially, what you can do with WCM inside of SharePoint is you could really extend SharePoint's WCM capabilities. And a place you might want to do this is if you stand up a small business site in Office 365, there's not full, robust functionality that is full parity right now between the O365 small business site and what you get on-premise with a FIS license or for internet license for SharePoint. And so maybe you need to use something like a content query web part functionality in your internet site on O365 site. But you don't have that capability as part of the platform right now, but you're really good at writing PHP and stuff. So you could take these same patterns, use what I've shown you here today, and build a more robust content query type capable thing to pull data out of SharePoint or other places and land it on your Office 365 small business site as well. So that's definitely a scenario that you might want to use. For on-premise scenario, maybe you've got some data and a PHP app right now that you use to browse products or information or documents specific to your company. And it allows you to perform some type of line of business thing. And it's content that you want on your intranet. You could take the same approach by introducing that app to integrate more with SharePoint and use these iframe concepts with the provider-hosted app to run it right inside of your SharePoint page as well to supplement a WCM capability too. Now, when I set out to do this, I thought, like I said before, like, oh my gosh, you know, this is cool, a session at the conference about something I haven't tried out before. What am I signing up for? I can't believe I'm doing this. But I always love learning new things, and too, but it really does make the point that for someone who hasn't coded in PHP except for making small edits to my WordPress blog before, jumping in and figuring out how to build a real, robust line of business solution here can certainly be done with the new app model in SharePoint. So it's very easy to do. All these code samples that I showed you, obviously I didn't have time to walk you through every single line of code here and the intricacies associated with it. They're going to become MSDN code samples. We're going to start that work to convert them into code samples very soon. If you'd like to know when they land on MSDN, I'm sure I'll know the day they go out there. Feel free to send me an email or something like that and say, hey, Todd, could you let me know when it's out there if you'd like to use it down the road. And if you'd like to use it sooner than later, let me ask the folks in Microsoft if they're comfortable with me distributing it, and I'd be happy to get it out to you if that's all right with them. I got in here today and my slide deck wasn't uploaded on the machine, so I presented it off mine. I don't have the usual please fill out an evaluation slide today, but I would appreciate it if you did that. Thanks for sticking around all the way until 6:15 tonight, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference and have a good time. Thank you.